All right, let's see. Right there. Okay. All right. So, we are now going to be talking about the first moves of the fascist dictators and of Japan into acquiring land and inevitably setting off a chain of events that will start World War II. But before we have that discussion, we start with a discussion of the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations, let's talk about what this is. Let's talk about how it was created. The League of Nations, as you guys will remember, was the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson. President Woodrow Wilson desperately wanted the League of Nations created as a part of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. President Woodrow Wilson, he talked about all of these, a league that would end all wars. A league that if all nations joined would be able to stop an aggressor nation from taking over another nation. And this, even though the United States never joined the League of Nations, and we talked about the irony of that, we did have 63 nations that joined, including the UK, or Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and Germany. Look at all three of these countries. Italy, Japan, and Germany all joined the League of Nations. And this was, again, an attempt to stop any nation from invading another nation. And yet, in 1931, we see just that. We see an invasion come in, one country, Japan, invading another country, China, into Manchuria. That should trigger the League of Nations. Something should happen out of that. Let's try and see what happens as a result. Now, the other thing that is relevant with the League of Nations is that it promoted mutual disarmament right here, right? Collective security and disarmament. Now, what disarmament means is not having a very big military, to not build all these new ships and new weapons of war. And the thought process on that is that World War I, one of the main causes of World War I was militarism, was building up an army, building up weapons of war. And so because of this, that means that the thought process was, if we can limit the amount of weapons of war, we'll limit wars like that from ever happening again. Now, of course, the problem with that is that while some countries are following disarmament, we see that some drop out of the League of Nations and don't follow disarmament. Now, this is a massive event. This is a very important event. This is Japan invading Manchuria in 1931. This is the first test of the League of Nations. What will the League of Nations do when Japan invades Manchuria? We have a couple reasons why Japan invaded Manchuria. Japan is frustrated. For one, it feels humiliated because it didn't receive the German land that it had conquered in World War I, which was the whole reason that Japan joined World War I, was to conquer those German islands in the Pacific. They weren't given those islands became mandates, and so Japan's frustrated because it had intentions for those islands. It wanted to turn those islands into food sources for Japan, meaning it wanted to grow crops there, especially rice, to help feed its large population. Japan itself is lacking in natural resources and areas for farming. It's also got a huge population. So the thought process of invading Manchuria here, Manchuria's got lots of rich farmland, and we can essentially use it as the rice paddies for Japan. That was the thought process, especially because Japan's hit hard by the Great Depression. So we're going to see an invasion into northern China, Manchuria, and that is going to be the first test of the League of Nations. Now, you can't just come in and invade another country without giving an excuse if you're going to try and reason this to the international community. And so Japan is going to stage an incident called the Mukden Incident to justify them coming in and invading Manchuria. The Mukden Incident was a situation where they literally put dynamite down and blew up their own railway line. We had lots of spheres of influence in China. We've talked about that many times. Japan had a railway through China, northern China, Manchuria, and they're going to blow up their own railway. They're going to blow it up, and then they're going to blame it on the Chinese. And because of this, then they felt justified in invading the area to secure their profits and secure their lands. But when they do this, the League of Nations isn't going to fall for this. The League of Nations is going to send in some investigators, and they're going to look around. They're going to see, in fact, this is an armed invasion of Manchuria. Japan has broken the rules. They have invaded another country, and we now need to do something about this. And yet, here we are in 1931, and the significance of that date is important, guys, because the Great Depression has just gotten going. Things are really, really bad in the Great Depression. It's very bad in the United States. It's very bad in Great Britain, in France. It's terrible in Germany, right? All of these places, the Great Depression is affecting countries. And now we have a situation where the League of Nations only works is if all of these countries come together and they try and go in and help Manchuria, help China. But when you're in the Great Depression, all these countries are looking out for themselves. I mean, we think about the tariffs that each country put up. They're looking for themselves. They're trying to get their own people out of the Great Depression. And so when asked, Great Britain now has a choice. You're part of the League of Nations, Great Britain. Do you want to go and help Manchuria? And so Great Britain says, I'm sorry, I'm kind of bogged down in the Great Depression. I can't really worry about that right now. France, do you want to go help Manchuria? Do you want to help China? And France says, no, not really. Nobody does anything, guys. The League of Nations has tested in 1931, and the test proves that the League of Nations isn't really doing anything. It's not going to prevent one nation from conquering another nation. And what this event does, it emboldens Japan, but it also emboldens the fascist dictators in Italy and Germany. This is going to show people like Mussolini and Hitler that the League of Nations isn't going to stop them from coming in and conquering new lands. And so our fascists grow bolder. In 1935, Italy invades Abyssinia. We talked about that one already. That's the invasion of Ethiopia, right? Benito Mussolini. And the League of Nations is only going to slap some weak economic sanctions on them. It's totally ineffective. No one's trading anyway during the Great Depression. And so at this stage, now Hitler is emboldened to move. And so Hitler is going to create two things. One, he's going to create his Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe is the new hyper-advanced German Air Force. This is unlike the world has yet seen in the military, guys. When we talked about World War I and all the new technology used in World War I, we talked about airplanes. And airplanes in World War I, guys, they were used mostly as surveillance, right? They weren't really weapons of war yet. That's going to change with World War II in a big way. And by far the most advanced Air Force is starting the war is going to be the Germans, is going to be the Nazi Luftwaffe, the Air Force here. Hitler is going to order conscription. He is going to start to create an army. Now, right away, this should be ringing some bells in your heads because Germany, because of the Treaty of Versailles, was told specifically, you cannot create a standing army. That was one of the specific provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, that Germany cannot create a standing army. And yet, we see that happening here. We see Germany creating an army. They are directly and knowingly violating the Treaty of Versailles and breaking the rules of the League of Nations. But they're doing that because it's already been proven through Japan invading Manchuria, through Italy invading Abyssinia, that there are no repercussions for these actions. And what happens as a result is Italy drops out of the League of Nations, Germany drops out of the League of Nations, and they start illegally arming themselves. Hitler starts drafting people into the army, and this is actually helping fight the Great Depression because it's solving unemployment. Now, you're no longer unemployed, you're now working in the army. You're being paid by the government, but it is creating an army at a time where the rest of the world is pledged to disarmament, to disarming. And so as this war starts to break out, what we see is that Germany is far more prepared for a war than anybody else when this war starts. And we see especially that that's going to result in unprecedented amount of early victories month after month after month in 1939 and 1940 for the Nazi Third Reich. The Third Reich is what Hitler is creating, what he believes is the third great German empire. And Hitler's going to start to make his moves. The first move that he's going to make is order German troops into the demilitarized zone. It's part of Germany called the Rhineland, which is here. Now, the Rhineland is a zone that at the Paris Peace Conference, George Clemenceau, the premier of France, said that there should never be an army in the Rhineland. This is an area that we want as a buffer zone, as a protection between Germany and ourselves. And he had reason to say this. You remember George Clemenceau was not happy with the Germans after World War I. In fact, he was the strictest in the Germans, on the Germans in the Treaty of Versailles. And he had reason to believe that because, remember, the Germans attacked the French in the Franco-Prussian War this way. Then they attacked the French again through neutral Belgium in World War I here. And, finally, George Clemenceau says there needs to be a protection. We need to have the Rhineland here as a protection in between ourselves and Germany. And this, then, with Hitler moving troops into the Rhineland, is once again a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And it's also just showing that Hitler clearly is up to something. He's doing something here. He's amassing troops next to France. And Britain and France should be doing something, but they don't. And this is a huge element of the beginning of this war, guys, is that Britain and France are going to adopt a policy of appeasement towards Hitler throughout the 1930s. It is going to be consistently saying, okay, well, Hitler can do this, but we've avoided a war by allowing him to do so. Okay, Hitler can do this, but that's okay because we've avoided a war. Over and over that is said, and now we've allowed Hitler to create an air force, the Luftwaffe, to draft soldiers, create a standing army, conscription, and now move soldiers into this demilitarized zone, the Rhineland. He's broken 3 rules already, and yet every time he's just appeased. And now that Hitler has this standing army, he has this modern air force, he's ready to go out and acquire what he said he was going to do in Mein Kampf, acquire Lebensraum, or living space. And we see he's going to, at first, make military alliances to secure that he's able to do so. First, he's going to make a military pact with fascist Italy. That's called the Rome-Berlin Axis. And then, because of a mutual distrust of communism, we're going to see that that's going to bring Nazi Germany and Japan together in what we call the Anti-Comintern Pact. Together, those 2 alliances make 3 nations allied together, and that is the Axis powers. What we saw in World War I, what started as the Triple Alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, has now gotten rid of Austria-Hungary, brought in Japan in the equation, and that has become the Axis powers. Okay, so a quote from Hitler here: the German question can only be solved by means of force, and this is never without risk. Now, I bring up this map, guys, because what we see is a side-by-side between Europe, a map of Europe. One on the left is Europe before World War I, and then the map on the right is Europe after World War I. And I want you to look at Germany here for a second, because Germany is considerably smaller before World War I and after World War I. And the reason is because Germany lost some land, especially to Poland. They also lost a little bit of land in Czechoslovakia. So these 2 places, Poland and especially northwestern Czechoslovakia, become immediate targets of Hitler. Also, we know that Hitler, in Mein Kampf, talks about uniting all German-speaking people. We have lots of German-speaking people in Poland. We have lots of German-speaking people in Czechoslovakia. We have lots of German-speaking people down here in Austria. Hitler himself is Austrian, and so that is going to be his first move. He's going to look to Austria. So Austria also has gone through some tremendously difficult economic times in the post-war era and the Great Depression. Austria became a new country after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they inherited the debts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we also see a fascist party in Austria. And Hitler is going to use the fact that fascism in Austria has become a big force, and he's going to threaten to invade Austria unless the Austrian government gives more power to the Nazi party. And when this happens, the Nazi party seizes power in Austria and then says, Hitler, come right in. We are going to pave the way for you. And they open up Austria for Hitler to move his forces and Germans to march into Austria. A day later, Hitler has arrived in Austria and announces the union, the Anschluss, between Germany and Austria. Now, Austria no longer ceases to exist. It is now part of Germany. So now the German Third Reich has begun to be created. First, we see the Union of Austria. But now, in looking for more Lebensraum, more living space, and to unite German-speaking people, Hitler turns to Czechoslovakia, particularly to this northwestern portion of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, where 3 million German-speaking people are living. Now, this place, this location, is mountainous, and therefore would be the most important place as far as geography to help defend Czechoslovakia if Germany wanted to attack Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, it's our main defense against Germany, but Hitler is going to start playing the same game that he played with Austria. Now, don't you think then that at this stage, Britain and France would have woken up and said, we need to do something about this. We can't let this maniac continue to take over land after land after land. And the answer, unfortunately, is that they are going to continue to keep a policy of appeasement. And Hitler, this maniacal, maniac, is going to start to use the press. He's going to start to make false and fake headlines. He's going to claim that the Czechs in Czechoslovakia were abusing the Sudeten Germans, the Germans living in the Sudetenlands. And they're going to have press headlines like, women and children are mowed down by Czech armored cars, or the bloody regime, the Czech murders of Germans. And so in order to protect these Germans, Hitler is going to put a mass amount of soldiers on the border between Germany and the Sudetenland. Now, in this very highly tensioned time, finally, the leaders of Britain and France are going to reach out to Hitler, and they're going to say, we need to do something about this. We need to talk about this. You are clearly violating several provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. We need to keep peace. What can we do? And so they are going to invite Hitler to the Munich Conference. Now, the Munich Conference, guys, is our best example of appeasement of Hitler, where we see Hitler given whatever he wants in order to avoid war. Now, this is some pretty nasty stuff, guys, some pretty embarrassing stuff in the history of the Allies, especially Britain, because we see the leader of Britain, at this time, the parliamentary leader, the prime minister, named Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain is actually going to shake Hitler's hand in Munich, and he is going to say, you can take the Sudetenland. You can have this land as long as it avoids future wars. And Hitler says, this is my last territorial demand. This is all I want. And at the Munich conference, we see the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, actually shake Hitler's hand and say, yes, you can have this land. Now, first of all, it's not even his land to give. Okay, this is part of Czechoslovakia. So right away, he's selling out an ally. He's giving away someone else's land. But also, why would you think that Hitler's going to stop here? He hasn't stopped at all. He's created this air force. He's created this army. He's marched into the Rhineland. He's marched into Austria. Now you're going to give him the Sudetenland too. And of course, it's not only me as the history teacher saying this. It's also people in Britain that are criticizing Neville Chamberlain. And his most outspoken critic was a man by the name of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, from the very beginning, said you cannot trust Adolf Hitler. You cannot trust this guy. You should not be appeasing him. We should be arming right now. We should be preparing ourselves for a war because this is going to get ugly quickly. And of course, he was absolutely right in this. The Munich Agreement, however, is going to give Hitler the Sudetenland without a fight. He is given this land. And then sure enough, just a couple months later, the German troops pour into what remained of Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia ceases to exist, and Hitler gloats about it here. Okay, the Third Reich has continued to expand. Now it controls Germany, it controls the Rhineland, it controls Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. All of this now is this Third German Empire, the Third German Reich. And Hitler's not finished yet, because now he's going to turn to Poland. Now, Poland, as we've discussed, does have a high German population. Hitler is going to use the press. He's going to use the same tactics that he used with Czechoslovakia. He's going to say that Germans are being mistreated by the Polish people, by the Poles, and that they need his protection. And then he's going to demand the port city of Danzig in Poland. And he knows really that at this stage that the Poles have no reason to acquiesce his request. They're not going to give him Danzig. And he really just wants an excuse to invade Poland. But finally, at this juncture, do we see Britain and France finally step up and say that we will not stand for this. We will not let this happen. If Hitler invades Poland, we are at war. Britain and France both say we will come in and protect Polish sovereignty. We will come in and declare war on Nazi Germany. But at this stage, both Britain and France are unprepared for war. They've been pledging to disarmament while the Germans have been rearming for years. And so they look to an unlikely ally. Britain and France say, if we are going to, defeat the Germans, it would be really nice if we had our ally that we had in World War I on the other side of Germany. Now, you recall that the allies in World War I, the Triple Entente, if you will, were Britain, France, and Russia. But Russia has gone through lots of changes since then, hasn't it? Russia, of course, dropped out of World War I and became communist. And now they're the USSR, the Soviet Union, and they're being run by the notorious Joseph Stalin, the mass murderer, if you will. And so at this stage, Britain and France don't really necessarily want to be associated with the USSR, but out of necessity, they say, well, it's not that we're pledging a marriage to Joseph Stalin, but we need him right now. We need him in this fight against the Germans. And so Britain and France have pledged to defend Poland, and they seek the USSR alliance. Unfortunately for them, however, Hitler was one step ahead of them. In a surprise twist that shocked the world, Germany and the Soviet Union pledge a non-aggression pact. They come together and they agree that they will not attack each other. Once great foes in World War I, we now see an alliance in World War II. Now, an alliance might not be the right word, and so let me amend that. I will say that in World War II, both of these two nations deeply distrusted each other. You might remember, of course, that Hitler was deeply anti-communist. He didn't trust communism at all. And Stalin knew that. And Stalin knew that Hitler was not someone to be trusted. So why then would these two come together and be allies? It really comes down to this. Hitler knew that he wanted to go out and conquer more lands. He knew he didn't want to be fighting the Soviet Union. And both these countries knew that if they allied together, that they could come together and invade Poland. Poland was created by mostly German land, but also Russian land. This created a new state, both taken from Germany and from Russia. Now, these two countries, Germany and the Soviet Union, see an opportunity to ally together and then invade Poland once again. So really, there's two handshakes that are going on here with this, right? We have one, the Soviets and Nazis pledge not to attack each other, but then two, they pledge to secretly invade Poland together. Hitler offers Stalin the eastern portion of Poland. He pledges to take the western portion of Poland. This is our German-Soviet non-aggression pact. And so, with this, Hitler now has the green light to invade Poland. And on September 1st, 1939, we see the Blitzkrieg into Poland. Germany is going to use their new military tactics, the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. And this involved a coordinated strike of where Luftwaffe dive bombers come in first, and they're going to rain bombs on strategic military targets, Polish military bases, airfields, railroads, cities, any communication towers, and then come in these new advanced German tanks, literally motorcycle troops, parachute troopers drop between enemy lines. There has never, at this point in world history, has there been such a coordinated strike throughout the air and on sea and on land that we've seen in this invasion, this Blitzkrieg invasion. And the major fighting is done very quickly. It's done in 4 weeks. Poland not able to defend itself, and in no way was Britain or France able to actually come in and help Poland because of how quickly the fighting was done, and especially because on the other side of things, the Soviets jump in. As per their agreement, here comes Russia, here comes the Soviet Union coming in from the other side. Germany, when it's all said and done, is going to annex the western portion of Poland, and Russia gets the eastern portion of Poland. Poland now ceases to exist. So if we look at this on a timeline, guys, first of all, I should mention that in this action, of course, we are in World War II. The invasion of Poland is the start of World War II because it brings in Britain and France. Now, the United States, not a part of that alliance. The United States, deep in its isolationism at this stage, but we now have a war between Britain, France, and then, of course, Germany, Italy, and Japan. That's where we've started thus far. If we can look at a review of what's happened so far. 1935, Hitler orders the creation of the Luftwaffe and orders conscription. In 1936, Hitler orders his troops into the Rhineland. In 1937, the Nazis bombed Guernica in northern Spain. It's part of a training exercise supporting the fascist Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. In 1938, the Nazis absorbed Austria, the Anschluss. In 1939, the Munich Agreement, Hitler takes the Sudetenland, he takes Czechoslovakia, and then he invades Poland. This is just a 4-year period in which Germany illegally rearms, drops out of the League of Nations, and starts to assemble the Third Reich. And Hitler is not close to done, because now we see Hitler invade neutral countries in Europe that are clinging desperately to their neutrality, knowing that through disarmament they are in no way, shape, or form able to withstand the new modern German army. And because of this, they're relatively easy conquers for Nazi Germany. In April of 1940, Hitler is going to invade and conquer Denmark and Norway, northwestern Europe up here, Norway and Denmark, right above Germany. And then in May of 1940, Hitler is going to invade neutral Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Belgium. And this is a move into France. And guys, these movements here, while Hitler is looking for Lebensraum, while he's looking for this more living space, really what these movements were to set up his two most important invasions. He knows, of course, that his two most formidable enemies are Britain and France. And Britain and France, you know, just to remind you, fought the Germans throughout the entirety of World War I. They were there from the beginning to the end. They fought especially in France. I mean, the Western Front was really in France when the French repelled the Germans famously at the Battle of the Marne in 1914 and remained in France for the entirety of the war. I mean, these are two long-lasting enemies of Germany, and we are seeing it once again in World War II. But really, while all of this is going on, while Norway and Denmark are being conquered, while the Netherlands is being conquered, what are they doing? What are Britain and France doing at this stage? Why aren't they coming to the aid of these countries? It has to do with the strategy of the French. And this, unfortunately, is considered by many one of the worst military strategies in world history. And it is going to not at all allow the French to remain nearly as effective as they were against Germany in World War I and World War II. And here's why. The French strategy is a defensive war. They want to assemble essentially a blockade around their country so that when the Germans invade, they're going to throw all of their military might at France, and France is going to inflict such heavy casualties that the Germans are defeated. That is their strategy. And had it been World War I, that actually would be a very legitimate strategy. You'll remember that World War I was all about trench warfare. It was all about allowing the enemy to come out of their trenches into no man's land and then shoot down the enemy. Unfortunately, that's not going to work in World War II because of the new presence of the dive bomber, of the parachute troopers, of all these things, and because of new advancements to tanks and military equipment in general. And so the French strategy is simply outdated, but their strategy is even worse than that initially, and here's why. What the French do is they're going to create something called the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is right here, denoted by this large red line right here. And this was a system of barriers, of trenches, of fortifications, of tunnels, modern caves, walls, a bunch of physically built fortresses and barriers that are going to try and repel a German attack. If Germany attacks France along this, barrier fortress line, they're going to be repelled. They're going to take heavy casualties. That's the French strategy. This is called the Maginot Line right here. And then the French are saying, okay, we know also that the Germans perhaps are going to do what they did in World War I, and they're going to attack through Belgium into France. And so the French are going to start to assemble most of their army here, over here between, on the border of France and Belgium. And their thought process is, when the Germans come through here, we're going to be ready. We're going to swing like a gate into Belgium, and we are going to engage the enemy right here. And the British, also the ally of the French, are going to start sending in troops along the English Channel, and they're going to continue to add divisions into this French front line. That is the great strategy of the French against the Germans in World War II. But they costly underestimate several things. But the most important thing by far is the fact that while they have all of these soldiers here, mostly French, but British soldiers are pouring in every single day, that they are leaving one area, the hinge of this gate that they're swinging up here, the hinge here, undefended. And that hinge is something called the Ardennes Forest. It's a thickly wooded forest that the French believed were completely impassable. The French believed that there was no way that the Germans would be able to move tanks and infantry through this forest. And that is going to prove to be one of the most costliest estimates in world history, because here's what the Germans are going to do. Now, first of all, if you can see this at home, okay, we've got the French armies here, and we've got British armies pouring in every day here, here, right? And so this is our battleground. This is our Western Front, if you will. And the Germans first are going to move through Luxembourg and Netherlands and Belgium. And they're going to come this way just as they did in World War I. And so just as we discussed, the Allies are going to be prepared to meet them there. But that was only a feint. That was only a distraction. The major invasion will come right through this forest, the Ardennes Forest. They move quickly through France. The French completely underestimated the new advanced German military. They would come in, demolishing crews would come in, they would demolish impassable trees, and then set up bridges in a matter of hours and move through this land quicker than the French believed they could. And all of a sudden, the Germans are now in France. And catching France completely off guard. The French now have to defend against an attack coming from here, an attack coming from behind them. They're essentially completely flanked, and the French and the British now are going to have to be in a full-scale retreat. First of all, France, the great enemy of Germany, is going to fall in only 6 weeks. The French have been around all throughout World War I, this great, powerful nation, and yet they are defeated in only 6 weeks in World War II. That's the big problem. And the other huge problem is that now that the Germans have made their way in catching France completely flat-footed, they're now going to push the now arriving British army back along the English Channel here. The British were supposed to be reinforcing troops on the front lines, but the Germans got through so quickly that now 200,000 British soldiers are pushed up against this beach right here. This beach is called Dunkirk. And at this beach is where we might see the end of the war for the Allies, guys. I mean, this is a military disaster because these troops are stuck with nowhere to go. Okay, the Germans are closing in. It is only a matter of time before all of this entire British army is destroyed. And if Britain loses its army, it's out of the war. There's no way it can possibly continue to fight. And so at this stage, we now see Winston Churchill take its greatest action of the war. Winston Churchill, now the British Prime Minister, is going to call upon the British people to go and rescue their army. They don't have enough naval vessels to do it. They can send in their navy, but they're not going to be able to rescue their army nearly in time. That's 200,000 men over there. So instead, Winston Churchill is going to call upon the civilians of Britain. He's going to say, if you have a sea-going vessel, you need to get over there to northern France and you need to save our army. And we see fishing boats, pleasure yachts, anything that can float is going to be sent across the English Channel to go and rescue their army. And sure enough, we see over 200,000 British soldiers and over 50,000 French and Belgian soldiers rescued in this daring rescue at Dunkirk. This saves the British army, and it saves hundreds of thousands of lives, and is going to keep the Allied war going. A masterful decision by Sir Winston Churchill. And while that is a victory and defeat, the French are defeated at this time. The French, as early as June of 1940, is now fallen out of the war. They have surrendered. And this is a tremendous blow to the democracies of the world. This is a tremendous, tremendous blow for Britain, who has lost its only ally in this, and that was all by itself against the Nazis. The Nazis now essentially control almost all of mainland Europe. I mean, with the exception of Spain, who is more or less an ally, Italy, who is an ally, and then southeastern Europe, which Hitler will turn his attention to next. I mean, the rest of Europe is the Third Reich. It is part of Germany now, and France is in a terrible situation because Hitler now has some dastardly plans for France. The French have the only real two options, which is continue to fight and take heavy civilian casualties, or to surrender. And the French decide to surrender. And so with this, we now see that the Nazis are going to start to really control France for 4 years. And they're going to occupy the northern portion of France. And they're going to make the French pay a huge tax every single day to support the German army of occupation. They're also going to force the French to work in concentration camps. And this is what the Nazis did. The Nazis believed that all people that they conquered were alien races. That's what Hitler called them. He said, this is a quote from Hitler, that there will be a subject of alien races. We do not need to call them slaves, or we do not need hesitate to call them slaves. And so because of this, the French people were used as manual laborers. They were put into giant farms to farm for the master Aryan race, or they were put into munition factories to create weapons for the Germans. This is true of all conquered countries. That's what Hitler wanted to do with these conquered countries, was force them to continue to feed the war machine, so to speak, of the Germans. Also, just to tell you the egotist of who Hitler was, the First War, World War I, ended with the Germans signing their surrender in a railway car. And they met on November 11th, 1918. They met in a railway car, the German forces and the French military commander, Marshal Foch. The Germans surrendered to the French in that railway car in 1918. Hitler is going to demand that when the French surrender here in June of 1940, that the French bring that exact railway car to sign their own surrender in. He is essentially saying that you forced us to surrender in World War I in this car. We are forcing you to surrender in World War II in this car. This is the kind of the sick, maniacal egotist that Hitler was. And we end today's lecture talking about Nazi-occupied France. France is split into two zones. The North Zone is completely occupied and controlled by the Nazis. They're having to pay a tax of about 400 million francs a day to be able to support the Nazi occupying army here. And then the South Zone is called the Vichy government. Vichy is a French city here, and it's essentially a puppet government. It's being controlled by the Nazis, but through a French leader named Marshal Pétain. And how they keep this French government under control is the Germans take a huge amount of French hostages, about 200,000 hostages, and if there are any sort of resistance down here in the French zone, they execute hostages to try and keep them, under control. And that's where our situation is in June of 1940, guys. I mean, at this stage, the Nazi Reich has expanded tremendously. They have moved throughout all of mainland Europe. I mean, with very, very few exceptions. I mean, the one area that's always safe is Switzerland because of its mountainous regions. But really, besides that, I mean, everybody is subject to invasion by the German Reich at this stage. And next lecture, we'll talk about the Japanese, U.S. entry in the war, and all the way through the battles and the end of World War II. It looks bleak now, guys, but it gets better. It's going to get better. Okay, so anyways, one quick note before I leave you. On this slide here, Nazi invasion of France, there's two really cool videos. The Maginot Line video and the Ardennes Forest video. It's got real World War II footage. It's cool stuff. If you're interested in this stuff and you have some time, definitely watch it. I would also say, guys, as you've now started to get these, if you've got some extra time, start working on your HPGs. I have the first HPG up there now, and I'm almost done with the second HPG. I should be done with that today, and I'll post that today. And so work on those as much as you can, guys. I know that you're probably getting a lot of online work right now, but this is going to be the best way that you can study for the test besides watching these lectures. All right, guys, be safe.